On the 1st of September 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, the guns of the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison of Westerplatte in the Vistula estuary. 16 German divisions simultaneously crossed the border. Luftwaffe pilots bombed cities that were still sleeping. In less than 48 hours, Great Britain and France would declare war on Germany. Thus begins the conventional narrative. But that story starts too late. The Second World War was not born in September 1939. It was born in the trenches of the Marne, in the halls of Versailles, in the small streets of Munich during the years of hunger and inflation, in the taverns where an Austrian corporal with a high-pitched voice learned to convert resentment into religion. It was born in the minds of men who were already dead when the first tanks rolled over Poland, in racial biology textbooks that had been circulating through German classrooms since 1899, in the humiliation of an army that never accepted having lost. This is the real story of how it occurred. The global crisis that no one knew how to see in time, or that they saw and chose to ignore, Otto von Bismarck was born in 1815 and died in 1898. Between those two dates, he built the most powerful state on the European continent. He also built, without knowing it, many of the conditions that would make the Third Reich possible. Barely 50 years separate the founding of the German Empire in 1871 from the first Nazi electoral victory in 1930. In historical terms, that is a sigh. German unification was an act of war. Bismarck forged the Reich through 3 armed conflicts: against Denmark in 1864, against Austria in 1866, against France in 1870. Each victory was more overwhelming than the previous one. Flags waved in the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles, a deliberate symbol of French humiliation, when King Wilhelm I was proclaimed Kaiser of the new German Empire on January 18, 1871. The Prussians chose that place with surgical precision. The memory of that day would burn in the heart of France for decades. And the memory of its reversal, the Germans humiliated in that same palace in 1919, would burn in the heart of Germany for much longer. The constitution that Bismarck designed for his new state lacked something that almost all modern countries considered indispensable: a declaration of civil rights. The Reichstag existed. Citizens voted with a participation that in 1912 reached an astonishing 85%, but the government did not answer to Parliament. The Kaiser appointed and dismissed chancellors. The army was, in the words of the theorist Karl Marx, a form of bureaucratic military despotism, wrapped in parliamentary forms, mixed with a feudal element. The Prussian army, specifically, occupied a position without equivalent in any Western democracy. Its budgets had to be approved in the Reichstag only every 7 years. Its officers had direct access to the Kaiser. Its non-commissioned officers who left the service automatically received positions in the state administration: policemen, postmen, railway employees. Half of the country's minor officials were former soldiers, raised to obey orders and treat the public as a potential enemy. Violence in this state had a different legitimacy than it had in countries like Great Britain or France. Bismarck had demonstrated it personally. The great questions of the day, he declared to the Prussian Parliament in 1862, are not decided with speeches and majority resolutions. That was the great mistake of 1848, but with iron and blood. Iron and blood worked. German liberals, who in 1848 had dreamed of a united and democratic Germany, forgave Bismarck his methods because he had achieved what they could not: a national state. But in doing so, they paid an invisible price. They had learned that the end justifies the means, that power conquers what the word cannot, that the nation is worth more than the law. It was the beginning of a lesson that Germania would take decades to finish learning, and as for unlearning, she would never fully do so. The second great Bismarckian legacy was the creation of internal enemies. In the 1870s, the Chancellor launched what his adversaries called the Kulturkampf, the struggle for culture, a systematic campaign against the Catholic Church. Prussian laws demanded that priests be trained in state institutions. Those who refused were arrested. The Bishop of Trier died shortly after serving 9 months in prison. By 1875, 225 priests were imprisoned and 989 parishes had lost their incumbents. All this had the enthusiastic applause of the liberals, who saw Catholicism as a threat to civilization. Bismarck then lashed out against the socialists. The anti-socialist law of 1878 prohibited their meetings, suppressed their publications, and outlawed their party. The German labor movement, which had nothing to do with the attacks that served as a pretext for the law, was crushed for 12 years. The liberals, convinced that socialism was a threat to order, applauded again. The result was predictable but fatal. Catholics, 40% of the population, formed their own party, the Zentrum, and closed themselves off as a persecuted community. The socialists, when their party became legal again in 1890, emerged with iron discipline, a visceral distrust toward all bourgeois parties, and an orthodox Marxist doctrine that excluded any collaboration with capitalism. The great abyss that this created between the labor movement and the rest of the political spectrum would survive until the 1930s, and in that fracture Nazism would find refuge. Bismarck also accelerated German colonialism with some reluctance, yielding to internal pressures. In 1904 to 1907, the German army in southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, perpetrated a deliberate genocide against the Herero people. From a population of 80,000 people before the war, the Hereros were reduced to 15,000 by 1911. It was the first time that the German state planned and executed the extermination of a civilian population classified as inferior. The name of that commander, General Lothar von Trotha, would be forgotten. The method, not. At the end of 1889, a Berlin primary school director named Hermann Ahlwardt was bankrupt. He had stolen money from his students' Christmas fund, had been discovered and fired. Seeking someone to blame, his attention fell upon the Jews. Ahlwardt was a second-rate lunatic, a repeat fraudster who would end up in prison for blackmail in 1909 and would die in a traffic accident in 1914. But his trajectory illustrates something deeper. The way in which modern anti-Semitism was born not from religious conviction but from personal failure. It found its fuel in resentment, not in theology. The German Jewish community of the late 19th century was a highly assimilated minority. It constituted around 1% of the total population, some 600,000 practitioners in a country of 67 million. In Breslau, marriages between Jews and Christians had gone from 9 for every 100 purely Jewish marriages in the 1870s to 35 for every 100 in 1915. In Hamburg, by the eve of the First World War, the figure reached 73 per 100. Between 1880 and 1919, some 20,000 German Jews were baptized as Christians. The process of integration was slow but real, and it created precisely the type of mixture that racial anti-Semites considered the most insidious threat: invisibility. Representation in public life was unequal. There were banking families like the Bleichroders. Bismarck entrusted Gerson von Bleichroder with the management of his personal finances, or the houses of Tietz and Wertheim in department stores. In medicine, law, science and journalism, Jewish men were overrepresented relative to their share of the population. That visible success, not real power, which was minimal, but the visibility of success became a perfect target for those seeking an explanation for their own failures. Modern anti-Semitism, racial, not religious, was formally born with a pamphlet published in 1873 by Wilhelm Marr, whose title read "The Victory of Judaism over Germanism Considered from a Non-Denominational Perspective." Marr was the first to insist that the difference was not in religion, but in the blood. 2 years later, he invented the word anti-Semitism, and in 1879 he founded the first organization with that term in its name, the League of Anti-Semites. His personal roots were banal. His second wife, who had supported him financially until her death in 1874, was Jewish. His third wife, also half Jewish, divorced him and forced him to pay large sums for the maintenance of his son. Marr concluded from those experiences that racial mixing was a recipe for catastrophe and elevated that domestic resentment to a law of universal history. What followed was an intellectual escalation that is surprising in retrospect. The historian Heinrich von Treitschke, a professor in Berlin and one of the most respected academics in Germany, coined the phrase that would become the slogan of generations: "The Jews are our misfortune." His colleagues at the university, among them the pathologist Rudolf Virchow and the historian Gustav von Droysen, publicly denounced that racial hatred and fanaticism, but the phrase survived the controversy and remained floating in the political vocabulary. The philosopher Eugen Dühring equated capitalism with the Jews and argued that socialism should be primarily directed toward eliminating Jewish influence in finance and politics. His influence over the socialist movement was powerful enough that Friedrich Engels dedicated his well-known treatise Anti-Dühring in 1878 to combating that contamination from within the labor movement itself. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, an Englishman married to Eva Wagner, daughter of the composer, published in 1900 The Foundations of the 19th Century, a work that fused anti-Semitism, racism and social Darwinism into a 1,200-page pseudo-scientific synthesis. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies before the First World War. Kaiser Wilhelm II read it, praised it as a wake-up call for the German nation, and maintained regular correspondence with Chamberlain for years. Anti-Semitism had reached the inner chamber of power. Richard Wagner, meanwhile, had published Judaism in Music in 1850 and spent the second half of his life radicalizing. According to the diaries of his wife Cosima, in 1881, Wagner commented regarding a fire at the Vienna Opera House, where more than 400 people died, many of them Jewish, that all Jews should burn together in a performance of Lessing's Nathan the Wise. His widow converted Bayreuth into a sanctuary where those ideas were cultivated with cult-like devotion. Ludwig Schemann translated into German in 1898 the treatise on racial inequality by the French Count Joseph Arthur de Gobineau. Houston Stewart Chamberlain published his work from the same circle. The Anglicism Aryan taken from Gobineau began to circulate in the German racist vocabulary as a term of positive identity, no longer just as a descriptive linguistic category. What made this network of ideas especially dangerous was its apparent intellectual respectability. These were not back-alley pamphlets. They were academic books, cited in universities, awarded in national competitions, discussed in the cultural supplements of major newspapers. At the darkest end of the spectrum, the editor of the newspaper Ostara, Journal for Blonde People, one Lanz von Liebenfels, raised a flag with a swastika over his castle in Austria in 1907. In Munich, the poet Alfred Schuler was recovering runes and solar symbols as signs of Aryan identity. The Germanic Order, founded in 1912, gathered conspirators who practiced pseudo-medieval rituals and used the swastika as a badge. They were marginal groups, but their ideas were not. They circulated in libraries, in parliamentary speeches, in the sermons of some churches. Regarding the eugenics movement, in 1905, Alfred Plotz and Ernst Rudin founded the Society for Racial Hygiene. In 1900, Wilhelm Schallmeyer's essay on eugenics won first prize in a national competition sponsored by Alfred Krupp, the arms tycoon. Ernst Haeckel, whose work The Riddle of the Universe had sold hundreds of thousands of copies in 1899, advocated for lethal injections for the mentally ill and for massive capital punishment to eliminate criminals from the hereditary chain. Haeckel was also an avowed racist. He did not believe that any curly-haired people had achieved anything historically important, but he was, paradoxically, a pacifist, because he considered that war would kill the bravest and best endowed, a position that made him unacceptable to future Nazis, although many of his other ideas would prove very useful to them. These ideas did not form a coherent ideology in 1914. Their promoters contradicted each other on key points. Schallmeyer rejected Aryan superiority as a valid category. Voltmann admired the French Revolution. Haeckel was a pacifist. But they gathered the scaffolding. They established the vocabulary. They classified human beings into categories of value and non-value. The German word was minderwertig, literally worth less. And they introduced the logic that the state had not only the right, but the obligation to manage its population as a breeder manages his livestock, eliminating weak specimens and multiplying the strong. That logic, applied consistently, led to a very specific place. They did not all see it in 1900. An Austrian corporal would see it with much time to read and think in the trenches of the Western Front between 1914 and 1918. The First World War was not an accidental catastrophe. It was, to a large extent, chosen. In July 1914, the ruling elites of Europe, particularly the Habsburgs of Austria-Hungary, found themselves before a crisis that could have been handled diplomatically, like so many before, and decided not to. German military leaders, with General Erich von Falkenhayn at the head, had been waiting for years for a preventive war against Russia before it became too powerful. Austrian strategists wanted to crush Serbia once and for all. No one calculated that the conflict would last 4 years and cost 20 million lives. The news of the war was received in Berlin in August 1914, with scenes of massive jubilation. A young Austrian who had been living in Munich for 2 years was photographed among the crowd, with his mouth open and eyes bright with emotion. His name was Adolf Hitler. Hitler was 25 years old and had no visible future. He had failed twice in the entrance examination for the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. He lived on alms and by selling watercolors in the streets. The war was his salvation. He enlisted the day following the declaration and was assigned to the List Infantry Regiment, where he served as a messenger on the Western Front for 4 years. He received the Iron Cross First Class, an unusual distinction for a corporal, for his bravery in combat. What the war gave to Hitler and to millions of Germans like him was a purpose, a community, a clear enemy, and, when it ended badly, a wound. Germany lost. The military high command, effectively led since 1916 by Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, who had established a silent dictatorship behind the civilian facade, informed the Kaiser in September 1918 that defeat was inevitable. The news reached the German public in a gradual and fractured way, after years of censorship that had hidden the true dimensions of the disaster. On November 9, 1918, mutinous sailors in Kiel initiated a revolution that spread throughout Germany in days. The Kaiser abdicated. A republic was proclaimed. On November 11th, the armistice was signed in a train carriage in the forest of Compiègne. Germany had lost. But in the minds of many Germans, and with the active help of the same generals who had led the country to catastrophe, an alternative narrative was quickly born. The army had not been defeated on the battlefield. It had been stabbed in the back by its enemies at home, the socialists, the Jews, the November criminals who had signed the armistice when victory was still possible. Hindenburg declared before a parliamentary commission in 1919, "An English general said correctly, the German army was stabbed in the back." Kaiser Wilhelm himself wrote in his memoirs, "My army was forced to collapse by the stab in the back from the revolutionaries at the very moment when peace was within reach. It was a colossal lie, but it worked because it was convenient. It exonerated the army, it pointed to an internal enemy, and it turned defeat into betrayal, failure into crime, grief into a thirst for revenge." Corporal Adolf Hitler learned of the German capitulation in a military hospital in Pasewalk, where he was recovering from a mustard gas attack. According to his own words written years later, he burst into tears for the first time since his mother's death, and he made the decision that would change the century to enter politics. On June 28, 1919, in the same Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles, where Bismarck had proclaimed the German Empire almost half a century before, the German representatives signed the peace treaty. The conditions humiliated them in that place with a symmetry that was not accidental. By the Treaty of Versailles, Germany lost 12% of its territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Polish corridor separated East Prussia from the rest of the country. Danzig was declared a free city under the League of Nations. German colonies were distributed as mandates. The army was limited to 100,000 soldiers, without tanks, without heavy artillery, without conscription, without military aviation. The navy was practically dismantled, and Article 231 forced Germany to accept exclusive responsibility for having caused the war the so-called War Guilt Clause, the legal foundation for demanding reparations that would reach astronomical figures. The final reparations, set in 1921, amounted to 132 billion gold marks. The annual installments would be paid until, well, the last one was paid by Germany on October 3, 2010. What made the treaty politically unsustainable was not so much its content, which, compared to what Germany would have imposed on the Allies in case of victory, according to Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg himself in September 1914, was relatively moderate, but the combination of its dictated character and its arrival at a moment of maximum national vulnerability. The Germans called it the diktat, an imposition, not a negotiation. The prohibition of the union between Germany and Austria was perhaps the most difficult to accept in terms of principle. The American President Woodrow Wilson had proclaimed the right of self-determination of peoples. The Austrians, en masse, wanted to join Germany. The Germans were willing to receive them, but the Allies vetoed it because that would have left Germany with 6 million more inhabitants and one of the great cultural centers of Europe, precisely what the Allies wanted to avoid. It was a flagrant violation of the principle that Wilson had held up as the moral justification for the war. The Allied military occupation of the Rhine, which lasted most of the 1920s, added salt to the wounds. The French in particular banned patriotic songs, encouraged separatist movements, and used African colonial troops in the occupied zone. The German right exploited this last point with a campaign of racist and pornographic propaganda Senegalese soldiers raping German women that was completely disproportionate relative to reality, but deeply effective in emotional terms. Germany did not return to peacetime after 1918. It remained on a war footing, against itself and against the world. The political violence that followed the armistice was unprecedented in modern German history. In January 1919, paramilitary units of the Freikorps Voluntary Corps of former combatants crushed a radical left insurrection in Berlin with calculated brutality. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, leaders of the newly founded German Communist Party, were arrested, tortured and murdered by Freikorps officers on January 15, 1919. Luxemburg's body was thrown into the Landwehr Canal, from where Berliners would recover it months later. The Social Democratic government of Friedrich Ebert had authorized and coordinated the operation. This was the moment that defined the German Republic, a democracy that was born crushing its left with the hands of its enemies on the right. The consequence was a permanent fracture. The Communists never forgave the Social Democrats for the murder of their leaders. The Social Democrats never fully trusted the Communists. And the right observed, learning, violence worked, temporary allies could be discarded, democracy was weak. At the beginning of 1919, Adolf Hitler was still a nobody, an Austro-Hungarian corporal without a job, without formal education, without family, without money. He was 30 years old and had no demonstrable achievement except 4 years of war. The army hired him as a political informant. In August 1919, the information group of the Army Command of Bavaria gave him elementary training in oratory and anti-Marxist propaganda at the Lechfeld camp. The instructors noted that Hitler stood out in an unusual way as a communicator. His superiors then sent him to infiltrate small political parties in Munich to detect extremist tendencies. In September 1919, he attended a meeting of the German Workers' Party Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or DAP, in the Sterneckerbräu brewery. The party had about 40 active members and funds of barely 7.50 marks. Hitler did not go to that meeting as a spy. He went to interrupt it. He listened to the main speaker who defended the separation of Bavaria from the Reich and could not contain himself. He stood up and spoke for several minutes with an intensity that left everyone in silence. The party's founder, Anton Drexler, a railway worker, secretly handed him a pamphlet. Hitler joined the party. He received member card number 555. Within 2 years, he would control it completely. What made Hitler different from the legion of demagogues who proliferated in post-war Germany was one single thing: his ability to speak. He had a gift for detecting the emotional temperature of an audience and raising it exactly 2 degrees more. His speeches did not follow the academic pattern argument, evidence, conclusion, but the evangelical pattern. The world is in ruins. It is their fault. I know who they are, and together we can redeem it. He spoke of German humiliation as if he had suffered it in his own body, because he had suffered it, in the trenches, in the hospitals, in the mustard gas that had left him temporarily blind in Passewalk. The first large acts of the party, held in January, February and October of 1920, gathered respectively 2,000, 4,000 and almost 1,000 people in the halls of Munich. The comparison with the initial meeting of 40 people was eloquent. The engine was always the same: Hitler. On February 24, 1920, before a crowd of 2,000 people in the Hofbräuhaus of Munich, Hitler presented the 25-point program of the party, already renamed Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, NSDAP. The points included the union of all Germans in a Greater Germany, the revocation of the peace treaties, land and colonies to feed the people, the expulsion of non-German immigrants, the death penalty for habitual criminals, usurers and profiteers, and the repeal of civil rights for Jews. It also contained pseudo-socialist demands: abolition of unearned incomes through work, confiscation of war profits, nationalization of large industrial trusts. It was a typical program of the extreme right of the time, mixed with anti-capitalist rhetoric to attract the working-class electorate. The inner circle that surrounded Hitler in those early years had very defined profiles. Rudolf Hess, a student of geopolitics with Karl Haushofer at the University of Munich, found in Hitler his earthly god. Naive, idealistic, without personal ambition, Hess introduced him to the theory of Lebensraum, the living space that Germany had to conquer in the East at the expense of the Slavs, and later introduced him to the affluent circles of Munich that would finance the party in its first years. It was Hess who convinced the wife of the piano manufacturer Bechstein to guarantee the first significant loans to the movement. Alfred Rosenberg, born in Revel, present-day Tallinn, in 1893, had arrived in Munich fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution with a visceral hatred of communism and the conviction that Lenin was the instrument of a Jewish conspiracy. It was he who introduced Hitler to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a Tsarist forgery from 1903 that supposedly documented a Jewish plot to dominate the world. Through Rosenberg, Russian anti-Semitism, in its most exterminatory variant, not exclusion but liquidation, penetrated Nazi ideology from the beginning. Dietrich Eckart, a failed poet and chronic alcoholic, was the man with money and contacts. Financed by Bavarian businessmen and by the political funds of the army, Eckart had been editing the weekly in plain German since December 1818. And in December 1920 he managed to get the party to buy the newspaper of the Thule Society, the Völkische Beobachter, which became the official organ of the NSDAP. Eckart introduced Hitler into the bourgeois salons of Munich, where the future Führer appeared at elegant parties in an army overcoat and dog whip, to the general amusement of his hosts, who considered him an exotic but useful specimen. Göring was different from all of them. An aristocrat, a decorated war pilot, the last commander of Jagdgeschwader 1, the legendary squadron of the Red Baron Manfred von Richthofen. His political weight was twofold. He gave the movement the legitimacy of war heroes before bourgeois conservatives, and he brought the paramilitary experience necessary to turn the SA into a real force. Göring joined the party in 1922 and assumed command of the SA in January 1923. The lawyer Hans Frank, who heard Hitler speak for the first time in January 1920, described the experience in the terms that hundreds of thousands of Germans would employ during the following years. He expressed what was on the conscience of everyone present. It was a revealing phrase. Hitler did not bring new ideas. He collected ideas that were already in circulation: the stab in the back, the internal enemy, the lost greatness, the need for strong leaders, and returned them transformed into certainty and an action program. People did not listen to him to learn something. They listened to him to hear him say out loud what they already believed and did not dare to say. The armed growth of the party began in 1920 with a hall protection section that acted as an order service at rallies. Brutality was the method from day one. On September 14, 1921, a group of Nazis interrupted a meeting of the Bavarian independentist Otto Ballestedt in the Löwenbräukeller, turned off the lights, beat him in the darkness with his head open, and threw him off the platform to the ground. Hitler was sentenced to 1 month in prison in Stadelheim. The warning from the police that he could be deported to Austria as a foreigner he still had not applied for German nationality had no effect. Ernst Röhm, a former staff officer with his face disfigured by a shrapnel wound at Verdun, was the architect of the transformation of that gang into a serious paramilitary organization. Röhm controlled the supply of weapons to the Bavarian paramilitary groups. They called him the Machine Gun King and had contacts throughout the armed right. In August 1921, he brought to the party the hardened veterans of former Captain Hermann Erhard, who had led sabotage operations in Silesia. The gymnastics and sports section was renamed Sturmabteilung SA in October 1921. By August 1922, it had 800 members. A year later, more than 15,000. Röhm's first autobiography, published in 1928, began with the words, "I am a soldier." His words of admiration were sturdy, reckless, ruthless, faithful. His terms of contempt, prudent, compromise, intellectual, bourgeois. He wrote about himself, "Since I am an immature and evil person, war and disturbances attract me more than the well-behaved bourgeois order." It was not rhetoric, it was description. Mussolini's march on Rome in October 1922, when the Italian king capitulates to the fascist threat without firing a shot, galvanized the Nazi movement. The Duce demonstrated that it was possible to take power with a combination of mass intimidation, conservative support, and government weakness. Hitler began to plan his own German version, not on Berlin too far away and too well defended, but first on Munich, using it as a springboard. In January 1923, the French occupied the Ruhr to collect German reparations in kind after the German government declared it could not pay them. Nationalist indignation reached its boiling point. The Berlin government responded with a campaign of passive resistance that paralyzed the country's main industrial region and accelerated hyperinflation to insane levels. Albert Leo Schlageter, a former member of the Freikorps who sabotaged French railway facilities, was captured, tried by a French military court and shot on May 26, 1923. The Nazis immediately turned him into a national martyr. Tens of thousands attended his memorial events. Schlageter's name circulated throughout Germany as a symbol of the weakness of the Berlin government and of the determination of the resistance. On November 8, 1923, Hitler burst armed into the Bürgerbräukeller brewery in Munich, where the State Commissioner Gustav Ritter von Kahr had just begun a speech before 3,000 people. Hitler jumped onto a table, fired at the ceiling, and shouted that the national revolution had begun. He captured Kahr and 2 other officials in a back room and forced them, at gunpoint, to promise their support. General Erich Ludendorff, who participated in the plot, agreed to legitimize the coup with his presence. Nothing had begun. Kahr and the other officials reneged on their promises as soon as they were out of the direct control of the Nazis. The next day, when 2,000 Nazis and supporters marched toward the center of Munich, accompanied by Ludendorff, they encountered a police barricade at the Odeonsplatz, next to the Feldherrnhalle. The police opened fire. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen died in a few seconds. Hitler, who was marching arm in arm with the former Bavarian Prime Minister Gustav von Kahr, threw himself to the ground. He had dislocated his shoulder in the fall. Goering received a shot in the groin. Only Ludendorff continued walking toward the policeman, who stepped aside before the old general out of respect or confusion and did nothing to him. The beer hall putsch was a fiasco. Hitler was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 5 years in prison in the fortress of Landsberg am Lech in comfortable conditions. He had an individual room, could receive visits, and the guards brought him cakes and flowers from his admirers. He served 9 months, during which he dictated to Rudolf Hess the first volume of Mein Kampf. In that book he outlined, with a clarity that seemed important to very few at that moment, the complete program of what he would do if he ever reached power. The trial was the platform that converted failure into fame. Hitler spoke for hours before the court. His words were reproduced by newspapers throughout the country. Millions of Germans who did not know his name came to know it. And the minimum sentence he received, 5 years with the possibility of parole after 6 months, demonstrated that the Bavarian judges considered that the coup had been, deep down, an act of misguided patriotism, not a crime. Between 1924 and 1929, the Weimar Republic experienced something unexpected: stability. The great inflation of 1923, when literally a wheelbarrow of bills was needed to buy a loaf of bread, and the rate reached 4,200 billion%, was controlled with the introduction of the Rentenmark in November 1923, and with the help of the American Dawes Plan of 1924, which restructured German reparations and facilitated international credits. In those 5 years of relative prosperity, the Nazi Party was marginalized. In the elections of May 1924, it obtained 2 million votes and 32 seats in the Reichstag. In December of the same year, 907,000 votes and 14 seats. In May 1928, 810,000 votes and 12 seats, less than 3% of the electorate. The party's electoral statistician wrote in his private notes that Nazism seemed to have reached its ceiling. Germany did not want extremisms, it wanted normalcy. But Weimar's normalcy had deep fissures. The first was structural. The German proportional system allowed dozens of small parties to obtain parliamentary representation, making the formation of stable governments almost impossible. Between 1919 and 1933, there were 20 different governments. German democracy had never had time to consolidate. It was born in defeat, baptized in violence, and grew under the shadow of the treaty that the majority of Germans considered illegitimate. The second was psychological. Weimar was, in the minds of millions of Germans, the system that had accepted defeat. The Social Democrats, the backbone of the Republic, carried the curse of having signed the armistice, of having stabbed the army in the back, even though it had been they who picked up the fragments of the imperial collapse. For the right, the Republic was illegitimate by definition. For the radical left, it was an instrument of bourgeois capital. The third was economic. The recovery of the 1920s depended almost entirely on short-term American capital. Large German banks, steel industries, even municipalities had financed their reconstruction with US loans. In 1929, the Ford Motor Company had factories in Berlin and Cologne. General Motors had bought the Opel plant in Rüsselsheim in 1929. The German economy was solid on the surface and hollow inside, dependent on funds that could be withdrawn at any moment. And on October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, that moment arrived. The New York Stock Exchange collapsed. The shockwaves reached Germany in weeks. The collapse was not surprising to those who knew the numbers. The German economy had depended since 1924 almost exclusively on short-term American capital. The Dawes Plan of that year and its successor, the Young Plan of 1929, had restructured German reparations in tolerable terms. But the real mechanism was circular. American banks lent short-term money to Germany. Germany paid reparations with that money to France and Great Britain, and those countries sent it back to the United States as payment for their war debts. It was a system that depended on the continuity of the flow of American capital. As soon as that flow was interrupted, the circle broke. By the end of 1929, the New York Times index had fallen from 452 points, its peak in September, to less than 200. On October 29, Black Tuesday, 16.4 million shares were sold in a single day, a record that would not be surpassed until 40 years later. That day, $10 billion of market value evaporated. double all the money in circulation in the United States at that time, and almost as much as the total cost of American participation in the First World War. American banks began to withdraw their loans to Germany immediately. It was a warning signal that no one knew how to read in time. German companies, which had used those funds to finance the industrial rationalization of the 1920s, the movement toward automation and mechanization that had impressed observers all over the world, found themselves without operating capital. Krupps and the Vereinigte Stahlwerke, the Unified Steel Consortium, had taken massive loans. German banks, in turn, had lent to their own industrial clients with that borrowed money. It was an inverted pyramid waiting for the first tremor. German industrial production fell 40% relative to its 1929 levels, a figure that only Austria and Poland matched in all of Europe. In Great Britain, the equivalent was a fall of 11%. In France, around 20%. The difference had a simple explanation. No other European country had financed its recovery with such dependence on short-term American capital. In July 1931, the Danat Bank, the Darmstädter National Bank, was the first of the large ones to go bankrupt. It had been the largest private commercial bank in Germany, and its collapse dragged the country into a general credit crisis. The government had to suspend the convertibility of the mark into foreign currency. From one day to the next, the German mark could not be exchanged for foreign exchange in international markets. That technically freed the government from the straitjackets of the gold standard and opened the possibility of reflationary policies expanding the money supply to create employment. Brüning chose not to do so. Unemployment rose with a speed that the subsidy system was never designed to absorb. The unemployment fund created in 1927 had been calculated to cover a maximum of 800,000 unemployed for a brief period. By the winter of 1930-1931, there were already more than 5 million registered unemployed. By early 1932, more than 6 million, approximately 1 in 3 active workers. But the registered unemployed were only part of the problem. Many worked part-time or had accepted jobs far below their qualification. The unemployed and their dependents totaled nearly 13 million people, a fifth of the total German population. In Berlin, registered unemployment went from 133,000 in 1928 to 600,000 in 1932. In Hamburg, from 32,000 to 135,000. In Dortmund, from 12,000 to 65,000. By the end of 1932, only 618,000 people were collecting the original contributory subsidy, while 1,230,000 depended on the crisis benefits of the central government, 2,500,000 on municipal assistance funds, and more than 1 million received no regular income because they had exhausted all legal deadlines. The municipalities, which carried most of the assistance to the long-term unemployed, were equally bankrupt. They had financed their infrastructure and housing programs of the 1920s with the same short-term American loans that were now being withdrawn. The city of Cologne, the city of Berlin, even small cities like Neustrelitz or Quedlinburg, all had issued bonds placed in the American market between 1925 and 1929. All those bonds were maturing now, and there was nothing to pay them with. An unemployed 21-year-old printer from Essen wrote in the autumn of 1932, "After long and aimless wanderings from city to city, my path led me to the port of Hamburg. But what a disappointment. More misery, more unemployment than I expected, and my hopes of finding work here vanished." 14-year-old girls wrote school essays in which they said that their father had been without work for 3 years and that they had already abandoned all hope. Small children played in the parks at signing for the subsidy, imitating the queues they saw every morning. On city corners, men with signs hung around their necks, looking for work of any kind. Groups of young people rode the train in a circle, the Berlin Ring, because it was the only warmth they could afford and they had nowhere else to go. Wild cliques, youth gangs that occupied abandoned buildings and stole to eat, proliferated. Arrests for theft in Berlin increased 24% between 1929 and 1932. Prostitution, male and female, became visible in the central neighborhoods of all major cities. The government of Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, appointed in March 1930 without a parliamentary majority, dependent on the emergency decrees of President Hindenburg, responded exclusively with deflationary austerity. His emergency decrees of June 5 and October 6, 1931, cut unemployment subsidies in multiple ways, restricted the coverage period, and extended the means testing system to access municipal assistance. The standard of living of the long-term unemployed was reduced every few weeks as they passed from the contributory subsidy to the central state's crisis benefits, and from there to municipal assistance, and from there to nothing. A decree of December 1931 additionally forced wages down to their 1927 level. Trade unions, civil servants, public sector workers all saw their incomes cut between 19 and 23% between December 1930 and December 1932. The population gave Brüning the nickname the Hunger Chancellor. Satirists compared him to Fritz Hamann, the serial killer of the 1920s who dismembered his victims, and dedicated to him a variation of the nursery rhyme that Hamann had inspired. Wait a little while, and you will see, and Brüning will come to get you with the 9th emergency decree, and he will turn you into mincemeat. The 9th decree did not arrive. Brüning was dismissed in May 1932 before he could sign it. But after having issued 4, he was already the most unpopular chancellor the Republic had ever had. The German economy had at that moment the legal tools to expand. Since the suspension of the gold standard in July 1931, nothing prevented the government from issuing currency to finance public works programs and job creation. The economist Wilhelm Lautenbach presented a memorandum to the government in September 1931 proposing exactly that. A state investment program of about 1 billion marks that could have created hundreds of thousands of jobs. Brüning ignored it. His objective was not only to resolve the economic crisis, it was to demonstrate to the Allies, through the visible suffering of the German population, that reparations were unsustainable. The Hoover moratorium of June 1931 had given him that victory. But he went ahead with austerity anyway, because he also wanted to use high unemployment as leverage to dismantle the Weimar welfare state and weaken the trade unions. His memoirs indicate this with a clarity that his subsequent apologists have never managed to explain satisfactorily. By 1932, it was possible to calculate how much time the recovery would take if policies did not change. Brüning said publicly that he expected the crisis to last until 1935. That prospect, 3 more years of that misery, was what pushed millions of Germans toward any alternative, no matter how extreme it might be. Nazism did not win over the Germans through terror. It won them over first through the ballot box. In the elections of September 1930, the Nazi Party obtained 6.4 million votes and 107 seats in the Reichstag, compared to 810,000 votes and 12 seats 2 years earlier. Goebbels' newspaper headlined, "An incredible breakthrough. I had not expected it." It was the largest electoral gain in the history of the Republic. In July 1932, the Nazis obtained 13.7 million votes and 230 seats, 37.4% of the electorate. They were by far the largest party in the Reichstag. Who voted Nazi? Electoral analysis reveals a complex picture. The party was stronger in the Protestant North than in the Catholic South. Catholics, protected by the institutional culture of the Zentrum Party, resisted much better than Protestants. Rural areas gave amazing percentages. In Wiefelstede, in the Weser-Ems constituency, the party obtained 68% in 1930. In Schwesing, in Schleswig-Holstein, 62%. In areas where its organizational structure had barely penetrated. The party was, in essence, a cross-class protest party. 1/3 of Nazi voters in 1930 had voted for the Conservative Nationalist Party in 1928. A quarter came from the Liberals. even a tenth of Social Democratic voters changed their vote to the NSDAP. 60% of its voters belonged to the middle classes in a broad sense. But the remaining 40% were manual workers and their families, although not those integrated into the trade union movement. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine was extraordinary. Rallies of 20,000 people in large cities, films, parades, brass bands, posters in every corner. Hitler traveled from city to city by plane, a deliberate image of modernity, to speak before tens of thousands of people who had been waiting for hours. His speeches did not offer concrete programs. They offered something more powerful, the promise that someone understood their anger, that someone named it, that there was a way out. Anger in the Germany of 1932 did not need much explanation. 1/3 of workers were unemployed. Those who remained employed saw their wages reduced month by month. Farmers lost their farms to the banks. Small shopkeepers saw how their businesses closed. Civil servants feared the next wave of cuts. And over all this floated the shadow of communism, which was also growing. The German Communist Party went from 54 seats in 1928 to 100 in November 1932. For the German middle classes, the fear of communism was existential. They had seen what happened in Russia: the expropriation of private property, religious persecution, the Red Terror. In the Weimar Republic, the Communist Party spoke openly of Soviet Germany and its militias. The Roter Frontkämpferbund fought with knives and guns against the Nazi SA in the streets of Berlin, Hamburg, and Düsseldorf. Louise Solmitz, a retired teacher and wife of a former Hamburg officer, summarized the mood of millions of Germans when she attended a Hitler rally in April 1932. Hitler's spirit sweeps you away. It is German and right. Her whole family voted for the NSDAP that summer. On January 30, 1933, at 11:30 in the morning, Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of the Reich. The man who signed the appointment was Paul von Hindenburg, President of the Republic, an 85-year-old war hero who had declared in 1932 that he would rather die before appointing the Austrian Corporal Chancellor. The man who convinced Hindenburg to do it was Franz von Papen, an aristocratic former chancellor and personal friend of the old president who was convinced that he could use Hitler as a tool and discard him at his convenience. "In 2 months, we will have pushed him so far into a corner that he will squeak," Papen said to a worried friend. It was a calculation of a naivety that bordered on the criminal. The process that led to the appointment was a sum of errors, opportunisms, and blindness. Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, who had replaced Papen in December 1932, found himself without parliamentary support, without the confidence of Hindenburg, and surrounded by enemies everywhere. The Nazis had suffered losses in November 1932. Their vote fell from 13.7 to 11.7 million, and they seemed to be in decline. But the economy was beginning to recover, and with it, the possibility that future elections would revitalize the old liberal and socialist parties. Papen, Hindenburg, the president's son Oskar von Hindenburg, and State Secretary Otto Meissner conspired to remove Schleicher and place Hitler in the chancellery before the moment was lost. Their calculations were those of a conservative elite that believed it could domesticate radical populism through the responsibility of government. The cabinet that Hitler headed on January 30 was numerically dominated by conservatives. The Nazis had only 3 positions: the Reich Chancellery for Hitler, the Ministry of the Interior for Wilhelm Frick, and a ministry without portfolio for Göring, along with the post of Minister of the Interior of Prussia. Papen was Vice-Chancellor. Conservatives occupied the other positions. What Papen and his colleagues did not understand, or chose not to understand, was what those 3 Nazi positions implied in practice. Control of the Prussian Ministry of the Interior gave Göring jurisdiction over the police in more than 2/3 of the territory of the Reich. In a matter of days, Göring transformed the police into an auxiliary of the SA. On February 22, 1933, he created an auxiliary police composed of members of the SA, the SS, and the Steel Helmets, the conservative militias, and gave them carte blanche to act. On that January night in 1933, Goebbels organized a torchlight parade through Berlin that lasted until past midnight. Columns of stormtroops marching with lit torches, passing under the Brandenburg Gate, while Hindenburg waved from his window. Young Hans Joachim Heldenbrand, standing in the crowd, noticed the same men passing in front of him again and again. They were marching in a circle to create the illusion that they were 100,000 when they were perhaps 20. "Like in 1914, wrote Louise Solmitz that week. Everyone could have fallen into everyone else's arms in the name of Hitler. Drunkenness without wine. She did not remember at that moment that the spirit of 1914 was the spirit of a war. The League of Nations, founded in 1919 as the embodiment of the Wilsonian dream of a collective peace, was never what it promised to be. The United States, whose president had conceived it, never joined. The Senate rejected the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 by 55 votes against 39, a defeat that left the collective security system without its architect and without its most powerful economy from the first day. The Soviet Union was admitted only in 1934, Germany between 1919 and 1926. The system depended on the will of its most powerful members to enforce it, and that will never existed in a sustained way. The first serious test arrived not in Europe but in Asia. In September 1931, the Japanese army invaded the Chinese province of Manchuria and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. The League condemned the action. Japan withdrew from the League in 1933. No one did anything else. The Lytton Commission, sent to investigate the facts on the ground, took more than a year to publish its report, which concluded that Japan had acted illegally but did not recommend military sanctions. The aggressor power interpreted that conclusion exactly as it should, as a license to continue. The failure in Manchuria was followed by that of Ethiopia. In October 1935, Mussolini's Italian troops invaded the only large independent state in Africa. The League imposed economic sanctions. The sanctions were sabotaged by the very members who were to apply them, including Great Britain and France, who had secretly signed the Hua-Laval Pact, a division of Ethiopia between Italy and an independent Ethiopia, which was leaked to the press and forced both governments to withdraw with humiliation. By 1936, the League as an instrument of collective security was a fiction. The Geneva Disarmament Conference, which had been meeting since 1932, dissolved without achievements in June 1934. The world was arming itself again, but now without any institutional framework that coordinated or limited that rearmament. The weakness of the international response to the aggressions of Japan and Italy had a direct consequence. It demonstrated to Hitler that security systems could be violated without serious consequences. That learning was systematic. Remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, no response. Absorption of Austria in March 1938, no response. Sudetenland in September 1938, negotiation and concession. Each episode confirmed Hitler's working hypothesis about Western democracies, which he had already formulated in Mein Kampf. They were systems governed by fear, public opinion, and electoral calculation, incapable of acting with the determination required by real power politics. In March 1936, Hitler ordered the remilitarization of the Rhineland demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles, sending 35,000 soldiers across the Rhine. The German staff had prepared immediate retreat orders in case of a French military response. There was no response. General Alfred Jodl wrote in his diary that the 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the moment of greatest nervous tension in my life. The tension was unnecessary. The French had at that moment sufficient military superiority to expel the Germans in days. They did not do so because the government of Pierre-Étienne Flandin feared that such an action would provoke an internal political crisis on the eve of elections, and because the British refused to support it. France needed Great Britain for any serious action against Germany, and Great Britain had not yet decided that Germany was the central problem. France and Great Britain were, in the 1930s, global imperial powers with commitments on all continents. Great Britain controlled more than a quarter of the Earth's land surface. France possessed the second largest empire in the world, with territories from North Africa to Indochina. Both were threatened simultaneously by Japan in the Pacific, by Italy in the Mediterranean, and by Germany in Central Europe. The British strategy, articulated in the report of the Defence Requirements Committee of 1935, was explicit. It is a cardinal requirement of our national and imperial security that our foreign policy should be so conducted as to avoid the possible development of a situation in which we might be confronted simultaneously with the hostility of Japan in the Far East, Germany in the West, and any power on the main line of communications between the two. A world with three open fronts at once was a world Great Britain could not win. Appeasement was not cowardice. It was strategic geometry, although a geometry built on assumptions that proved false. France and Great Britain also did not possess the military resources to act firmly before 1938. French military spending was 14 billion francs in 1932 and barely 15 billion in 1936, a budgetary paralysis during critical years. Great Britain spent £185 million on defence in 1936, and only raised that figure to 719 million in 1939, when rearmament accelerated in an emergency. The production of French aircraft in 1937 was 1/3 of the British and 1/8 of the German. Both countries prepared for a long war of attrition, trusting that financial and colonial superiority would eventually defeat the German economy through naval blockade, as had happened late between 1914 and 1918. That strategy required time to accumulate resources. Appeasement bought that time, or so believed those who practiced it. Fear of communism additionally complicated the picture. In British conservative circles, fascism was considered a lesser evil compared to Bolshevism. Sir Alexander Cadogan, head of the British diplomatic service, noted in his diary that he feared a war might put all Europe at the mercy of Russia. The Cabinet Secretary, Sir Maurice Hankey, wrote in 1936, "With France and Spain threatened by Bolshevism, it is not inconceivable that sooner or later it may pay us to ally ourselves with Germany and Italy." These phrases reveal the mental map of those who made the decisions. They did not see a Europe divided between democracy and fascism, but between conservative order and communist revolution. And in that division, fascism was, for many, the right side. The policy of appeasement was not stupid cowardice, as later historiography caricatured it. It was, as the historian R.J. Overy pointed out, the traditional continuation of 19th century British diplomacy, maintaining the balance of powers through calculated concessions, negotiating from a position of relative strength. The word itself, in its original use, did not have connotations of weakness. It meant satisfying the reasonable demands of an adversary to avoid conflict. The problem is that it was not negotiated from a position of strength. It was negotiated from the fear of another conflict like that of 1914 to 1918, with countries whose populations had lost an entire generation of young men in the trenches and who were not willing to repeat the experience for Danzig or the Sudetenland. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who entered office in June 1937 and assumed personal control of foreign policy, with an energy that his predecessors had refused, was a pragmatic politician who genuinely believed he could produce a great settlement of international problems through direct negotiation with the dictators. He was not naive. He knew that Hitler was dangerous. He called him, in private, half mad. But he calculated that the risks of confrontation outweighed those of concession, and that treating Germany with respect and common sense, his words, he could reintegrate it into the international system without war. That calculation depended on an incorrect premise, that Hitler was a conventional statesman with negotiable objectives, not the leader of a millenarian movement with literally limitless objectives. The historian R.J. Overy documents how Göring declared to German economic leaders in 1938, "All the time my thoughts revolve around one thing. When will the war come? Will we win? What can we do? Only a nation that bets everything on its armaments will be able to continue its existence." That was the real mentality of the regime. They did not want to be appeased. They wanted war. Appeasement did not give them what they demanded. It gave them time to prepare the next blow. In March 1938, Hitler absorbed Austria into the Reich without firing a shot, the Anschluss that the Treaty of Versailles had expressly forbidden. 6 million Austrians became citizens of the Reich in one night. In September 1938, in Munich, Great Britain, France, Germany and Italy signed the agreement that ceded the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia to the Reich. Russia was not invited to the conference, nominally because Chamberlain alleged that fascist leaders would refuse to sit with Soviet representatives, but in reality because no one wanted Stalin to be a formal part of the dismantling of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain flew 4 times to Germany in 3 weeks, to Berchtesgaden, to Bad Godesberg, to Munich, yielding on each trip a little more than he had conceded on the previous one. When he returned to London, waving the paper of the agreement and proclaiming "Peace in our time," he was received with a relief bordering on collective hysteria. The crowd cheered him. His popularity reached the highest point of his entire political career. The Munich Agreement destroyed Czechoslovakia as a viable defensive entity. Without the Sudetenland, where the country's main fortification lines, 80% of industrial arms capacity, and most of the foreign exchange reserves were located, the rest of the state was indefensible. Great Britain offered a loan of £10 million to soften the blow. The Czechs were not consulted on the conditions affecting them. They were informed. The difference between consulting and informing was the difference between an ally and a chess piece. In March 1939, Hitler dissolved the last remains of Czechoslovakia, occupied Bohemia and Moravia with German troops on March 15th, and turned Slovakia into a satellite state. He had explicitly violated what was agreed in Munich 6 months before. In London, Chamberlain finally understood that appeasement had reached its limit. On March 31, 1939, Great Britain gave formal guarantees to Poland. If it was attacked, Great Britain would enter the war. The guarantee to Poland was symbolically powerful and militarily almost empty. Great Britain had no way to physically defend Poland. What the guarantee did was to signal a limit. If Hitler crossed that limit, there would be war with the Western powers. Hitler did not believe it. From his perspective, he had forced every limit they had placed on him for 6 years. Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, Bohemia without any real consequence. The British and the French had yielded on every occasion. Why would it be different this time? In the spring of 1939, Hitler demanded from Poland the cession of the corridor that separated East Prussia from the rest of the Reich, the return of Danzig, a free city under the League of Nations, but with a German majority to the Reich, and concessions on the use of infrastructures in the corridor. Beck's Polish government rejected the demands. The Polish refusal was, in the context of the previous 6 years, extraordinarily brave, and it sealed the fate of the country. On August 23, 1939, while European capitals watched with disbelief, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement between the two regimes that had spent the last 6 years presenting each other as the existential enemy of civilization. The pact contained secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned between both states. When the news reached London and Paris, the analysis was unanimous. Without the threat of a Soviet Eastern Front, Germany could concentrate all its forces in the West. War was now inevitable. The dawn of September 1, 1939, the guns of the Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on Westerplatte. At the same time, German special forces disguised as Poles had attacked a radio station in Gleiwitz on the border, leaving bodies of prisoners from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp dressed in Polish uniforms as proof of the casus belli. The headline of the official Nazi party newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, the next day, "Poland attacks Germany." On September 3, Great Britain declared war on Germany. France did the same hours later. The Second World War had begun. The war was not inevitable. At no point on the road between 1919 and 1939 was it inevitable. At Versailles, a less punitive peace, or equally importantly, a peace more honestly conceived and better defended, would have altered the equation. In the 1920s, If American credits had not financed an artificial recovery that would collapse with the first economic shock, Weimar Germany would have had real chances to consolidate. In 1930, if Hindenburg and the conservatives had defended democracy instead of trying to use it as a tool, Nazism would have remained a marginal force. But each of those ifs dissolved before reality. The victors of 1919 wanted revenge and security, and the peace treaty tried to provide both without achieving either. German conservatives believed they could use the Nazi movement without being used by it, and they were wrong with consequences for all of humanity. The Western democracies of the 1930s were exhausted, disoriented, terrified at the memory of the previous war and at the ghost of the present communism, and chose appeasement until it was too late. And at the center of everything, a man who had converted personal failure into political ideology, collective resentment into a government program, and cruelty into a state system. Hitler was not the only person responsible for the war, but he was the element without which the other pieces would not have fit together in the way they did. The historian Richard J. Evans pointed out that the distance between the founding of the Bismarckian Reich in 1871 and the Nazi electoral victories of 1930-1932 was barely 50 years. The historian R.J. Overy emphasized that the War of 1939 was declared by Great Britain and France against Germany, not the other way around, and that this forces us to ask the right questions about why they made that decision at that moment and not before. Both are right. The story of how the Second World War began is the story of a system that accumulated tensions for decades, of an economic crisis that released them all at once, of leaders who miscalculated at every crossroads, and of a political movement that knew how to convert fear, humiliation, and hatred into votes, and votes into power. 6 years after Hitler's arrival to power, Europe would burn from the Atlantic to the Urals. 50 million deaths later, the world that survived would have to decide what to do with what it had learned.